Welcome to this UCL lunch hour lecture on the witch in the Bible and beyond, the misuse of the scriptures during the witch hunts. My name is Dr. Anne Jeffers. I'm research associate at the Margaret Beaufort Institute, University of Cambridge. It is my honor, privilege, and I have to say great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Alinda Damsma. Dr. Alinda Damsma lectures in ancient Semitic languages in the Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies. She received her Bachelor and Master of Divinity from the Rijksuniversiteit Amsterdam in 2003 and a PhD from the Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies, UCL, in 2008. After her PhD, she conducted postdoctoral research at the University of Cambridge and UCL. Before she rejoined UCL in 2019, she taught at King's College London, Leo Baeck College, and the University of Oxford. Her current research focuses on the use of Aramaic in Kabbalistic writings. In addition, she is working on a monograph which examines the role and the impact of the Bible on the early modern witch hunts. Her research interests are the Hebrew Bible, Bible translations, the ancient Near East and its languages, Jewish mysticism, and magic, divination, and witchcraft in biblical and post-biblical times. Before we begin, I wanted to let you know that we will have some time at the end of the lecture for questions, and these can be submitted at any point during the talk by going to Slido on your web browser and entering the event code #witch. I will now hand over to Alinda for their talk.
Many thanks for your very kind introduction. I was delighted when Dr. Anne Jeffers accepted my invitation to chair this talk. Dr. Anne Jeffers and I, we have known each other for quite some time, and her research on magic and divination in the Bible and beyond has been hugely influential for my own work. I also wish to thank my colleagues from UCL's events team for making today's lecture happen. It was a huge pleasure working with them as well. And good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for joining this lunch hour lecture on the witch in the Bible and beyond. Because my own research specialism is in the Hebrew Bible, known as the Old Testament in the Christian tradition, I mostly use the term Bible within the context of the Hebrew Bible, rather than the New Testament. This is also because the Hebrew Bible was mostly used during the time of the witch hunts to demonstrate the existence of witches and witchcraft in the times of old. But what do I mean with the word witch in this lecture? Often, from when we were little, we grew up with the stereotypical idea of a witch as an older woman. She has wild, flowing hair, and she has this cackle laugh, and she's up to no good. A bit like the cartoonish character you can see here on the screen. Of course, a witch can also be a practitioner of beneficial magic. She can be a good witch, or he can be a good witch. Especially nowadays, there are people who identify themselves as witches, and they often have the best and purest intentions at heart. For now, however, I will address harmful magic. Definition is found in the landmark study by Professor Ronald Hutton, The Witch, A History of Fear from Ancient Times to the Present. Now, this is just a working definition, and I'm using it to avoid possible confusion in what is meant with the word witch during this lecture. At first sight, it may seem odd to pair the Bible and witchcraft together. Often people think that the Bible on the one hand and topics such as magic, divination, and witchcraft on the other don't go together. For instance, here on the screen, you can see a picture that was taken in 2016 during the Witch Fest festival held in New York City. Now, and then in the background, you can see some protesters carrying signs that seem to negate any link between Christianity, the Bible, and topics such as magic and divination. But look here, at the same witch festival, we see a festival goer holding a sign that says, "Witches heal." So what is actually going on? Is the Bible completely opposed to anything dealing with magic, divination, and witchcraft? Does the Bible provide all the ammunition to fight these beliefs and practices? Or is the situation a bit more nuanced than that? In the late medieval and early modern period, witchcraft was considered a reality across Europe and the British Isles. The witch and her maleficium, witchcraft, struck fear in the hearts of many, king and commoner alike. Proponents of the witch hunts turned to the Bible in search of scriptural justification to denounce witches and their witchcraft. Many people, mostly women, but also men and even children, were accused of witchcraft and subsequently put on trial, and which frequently led to the death penalty. I would like to stress that most of the victims of these witch hunts had no actual involvement in magic or divination. Often, under torture, people would confess to having slept with the devil, killed livestock, having caused bad weather, having killed and eaten babies. And also under torture, they would give the names of other witches who were in fact equally innocent. Sometimes there were people that had engaged in beneficial magic, for instance, herbal magic, healing, or some soothsaying. But again, it was done with no harmful intentions. In recent years, we have regularly heard about efforts in the UK, across Europe, and also in North America to exonerate and commemorate these innocent victims. We increasingly read about apologies and even legal pardons that are being issued and memorials being erected. My own research approaches this dark chapter in history from an important yet underexplored angle, and that is the role and the impact of the Bible on the witch hunts. During the witch hunts, the learned elite, which could be clergy, clergymen, jurists, physicians, and even a king, they wrote tracts about witchcraft and witches. These tracts are known as demonologies, and they provided the intellectual foundation of the witchcraft beliefs that circulated throughout that period. And some of these beliefs are the pact with the devil, the witches' Sabbath, and also had the night flight of the witches. The introduction of these demonological ideas and their actual application in the witchcraft trials had devastating consequences across Europe from the 15th century onward. The most notorious and influential demonology is the Malleus Maleficarum, known as the Hammer of the Witches in English. It was published in the late 15th century. Now, these demonologies, they are full of scriptural references which serve as proof text. And what do I mean by proof text? According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, a proof text is a scriptural passage that is used as proof for a theological doctrine, a belief or principle. The writings of the demonologists relied heavily on the Bible to prove the reality of witches and witchcraft. Now, what is interesting is that the demonologists particularly referred to the Hebrew Bible. Of course, magic and divination also feature in the New Testament, but most proof texts that are used, they stem from the Hebrew Bible. Now, how can we explain that? When Jesus and his followers perform miracles, these acts are seen as divine miracles. The same holds true for the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. As a result of their holiness and their closeness to God, these prophets are able to perform supernatural deeds. They did not practice magic, but God empowered them to do so. This in contrast to the magicians from Egypt, whom we encounter in the book of Exodus. Another characteristic of the demonologies is their derivative nature. The writers frequently borrow from one another, including the proof texts. So there is a lot of, sort of plagiarism going on. For this lecture, I have chosen the biblical story about the woman of Endor, which we find in the first book of Samuel, chapter 28. In this story, we encounter King Saul, and King Saul was the first king of ancient Israel. On the eve of a crucial battle, Saul wishes to consult a female necromancer, a modern-day medium, so to speak, because he is desperate to get a message from God on the outcome of this battle. God had previously rejected King Saul. He no longer deemed him worthy to be a king. And therefore, King Saul was unable to seek advice from God's legitimate prophets and other means of legitimate divination. In his despair, King Saul decides to consult a medium, and he specifically asks for a female medium. Now, to cut a very long story short, the female medium, she lives in Endor and she raises the spirit of the prophet Samuel, and this at the request of King Saul himself. The prophet Samuel was once Saul's trusted ally, and he also anointed him as king over Israel. Now, the prophet Samuel delivers a very harsh message to the king. Samuel confirms that God has rejected Saul and that he and his sons will join him tomorrow in death when they lose their lives in the battle. Understandably, King Saul is deeply upset when he hears this message and he collapses. The woman of Endor urges him to get up and eat something in order for him to regain his strength and to go into battle. The image of the woman of Endor that we get from this story is of a woman who is very kind, hospitable, and she is coming to the aid of someone who is in his darkest hour. I've chosen this proof text because it featured most prominently in the early modern witchcraft debates. The demonologists usually depicted the woman of Endor as a witch, a ritual magician. She is a servant of the devil. Two rival theories dominated the continental witchcraft debates, and these theories they are about the nature of Samuel's apparition. Predominantly Catholic Bible commentators argued that Samuel himself, or at least his effigy, was raised. Mostly Protestant commentators said that this apparition was a demonic illusion. The demon was a lying spirit whose task it was to deceive King Saul and to lead him and his sons to death. Although the demonologists denounce the woman of Endor as a witch, I would like to stress that the Hebrew text itself does not call the woman of Endor a witch. Her practices are not described as witchcraft. The biblical Hebrew word for witch is mechasheva, and we also find the term Ba'alat Keshafim, a mistress of witchcraft. Now, both these terms, they are missing in the story about the woman of Endor. Instead, the woman is called a mistress of the spirits of the dead, a Ba'alat Of. She's a necromancer, a medium. She communicates with the dead on behalf of the living. Therefore, calling her a witch is an error. Also, the story itself, as I said before, does not equate necromancy with the dark arts, because harmful magic is done to deliberately target someone, to deliberately cause harm, and necromancy is not meant like that. It's a form of divination, not witchcraft. However, elsewhere in the Bible, in the book of Chronicles, which is younger than the book of Samuel, we find a brief reference to that fateful event. In the first book of Chronicles, we read the following. Saul died for the trespass that he had committed against the Lord in not having fulfilled the command of the Lord. Moreover, he had consulted a ghost, or a necromancer, to seek advice, and he did not seek advice of the Lord. So he had him slain, and the kingdom transferred to David, son of Jesse. Here we can see that King Saul's visit to the woman of Endor is already cast in a negative light. King Saul's visit to the woman of Endor has become one of his major transgressions, and the composer partly attributes Saul's death to his consultation of a necromancer. So already in the Bible itself, we start seeing a shift in the perception of the story. Whereas the text in Samuel takes quite a positive, or at least neutral stance towards the woman of Endor, the book of Chronicles casts necromancy in a negative light by making it one of Saul's transgressions. But even in the book of Chronicles, the woman of Endor is not yet called a witch. How then did the story in 1 Samuel 28 becomes such a prominent proof text? Would demonologists just open a Bible and look for a suitable text? Now, this is not usually how it went. For this proof text and many other texts from the Bible, the demonologists relied heavily on the church fathers. The patristic exegesis of 1 Samuel 28 had a profound influence on the interpretation of this narrative by the demonologists. The reliance of the demonologists on the authority of the church fathers was by no means unique. Medieval scholasticism was also deeply rooted in classical Christian exegesis. And the Renaissance had the motto ad fontes, back to the sources. And this really triggered the interest in the church fathers at that time. Their writings became increasingly accessible through translations and textual research. Therefore, in order to understand the role of this story in the demonological writings and also in the witch hunts in general, we have to examine the perception of this story in the patristic corpus. The church fathers, in turn, relied heavily on the translations of this biblical story in the ancient Bible versions. Most importantly, the Greek Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate. The Septuagint translated the Hebrew term Ba'alat Of as a ventriloquizing woman who speaks from the belly. Most translators and commentators interpreted a woman of Endor's ventriloquism as some kind of genuine or demonic divinatory technique. So she was not using her own voice, but out of her body came the voices of the spirits or demons. In rabbinic literature, we also find the notion that the voices of the dead speak from between the joints or from the armpit of the Ba'alat Ov. The Latin Vulgate used the word Pythonissa for the woman of Endor. This ancient version understood the woman of Endor to be a woman who possesses a python. The term python may go back to the mythological serpent that was slain by Apollo at Delphi, formerly called Pytho. Given the connection with the Delphic oracle, the term python was subsequently associated with the power to divine the future. Hence, the word Pythonissa originally referred to a woman who had the gift of divination. However, in the course of the Middle Ages and also in early modern periods, this term became associated with witchcraft. It also entered the English language, and there it took on the same development. It was no longer a designation for a female diviner, but it came to be understood as a witch. The scholar Klaas Smelik wrote an article about the various patristic views on the story in 1 Samuel 28. And following his work, we can reduce the various opinions to 3 groups. According to the first group of church fathers, Samuel was indeed raised up by the woman of Endor, or at least his spirit. The church father Origen, he wrote a sermon on this story, and in it he confesses that he was very troubled by this narrative, and he does not dare to deviate from it, because after all, it's scripture that says that the woman saw Samuel. The Holy Spirit never lies, so it must be true. The witch must have seen Samuel and not a demon. And then, according to the second group, these church fathers object the idea that this evil woman had power over the righteous prophet Samuel. They do not think that necromancy was a complete fraud, but they assume that God was still in power. It was God's wish that King Saul would receive his message this way, in this peculiar way, I have to say. Why? Because the Lord wanted to punish Saul by announcing his death to him in order that he would accept the verdict and part from life groaning. But as Saul did not listen to the prophet during his life, a special kind of prophecy was needed this time round. And then, finally, the third group seems to have been the most authoritative. According to their beliefs, it is not uncommon for the devil and his demons to take on the appearance of a righteous man. Moreover, these writers believe to have found some clues in the story itself, which indicate that Samuel did not appear. Because in verse 13, the woman says that she sees Elohim coming out of the ground. Now we can understand the Hebrew word Elohim as gods, but these church fathers say no, it's the word for demons in this context. Also, they find the speech of the prophet Samuel in the story a little bit suspicious. He doesn't rebuke the King Saul harshly. And he also says, tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. And they say, these church fathers, with me, because the me is the devil. Saul and his sons will be with the devil tomorrow. I will now introduce you to some early modern demonologists and their views on the woman of Endor. Now here on the screen you can see Johannes Weer. And Johannes Weer was a physician and he wrote demonology halfway the 16th century. Weer was critical of the persecution of alleged witches, although his views were rather moderate compared to later skeptics. As a physician, he tried to find alternative reasons for the behavior of some of these women. For instance, maybe they suffered from melancholy. What is also very interesting in his demonology, at least for my own research, is that he critically looks at various terms in the Hebrew Bible that deal with magic and divination and witchcraft. Now, he himself did not know the Hebrew language, but he was supported by a very famous Hebraist, and his name was Andreas Macius. And Andreas Macius helps him to understand the meaning of this terminology. And we are now going to look at what Weer says about the term oath. And we already encountered that term, the Ba'alat oath. Now, according to Weer, for the Hebrews, the word oath signifies a bag or bottle. Therefore, the demons who gave responses in obscure voices from the more remote parts of the body, such as the armpits or the pudenda of women, as though from a bag or bottle, were called oath by the Hebrews, or in the plural, ovot. Now, the interpretation of the term oath as a bag or a bottle is now commonly dismissed. Yeah, we find this term in the book of Job, and there it has the meaning bag or bottle. It may have the meaning bag or bottle, but not in necromancy-related passages in the Hebrew Bible. They look identical, but they have a completely different meaning. So also according to Weer, the woman was able to let the prophet speak via her body. There was one demonologist who did not accept the idea that the woman of Endor was a ventriloquist, and that was the Englishman Reginald Scott. He was really disgusted by the witch hunts of his time, and in response, he wrote a lengthy study, The Discovery of Witchcraft, which was published in 1584. Scott refuted and ridiculed both popular lore and learned writings about witches and witchcraft. He especially ridiculed the hammer of the witches, this demonology that I mentioned before. He consistently calls the demonologists witchmongers. So England's first demonologist happened to be also a skeptic. Scott's skeptical attitude towards witchcraft was also visible in his treatment of our biblical story. He explained the events that occurred during Saul's fateful visit to Endor as deception. The woman had simply answered to Saul in Samuel's name. She had used, maybe she had lowered her voice, and then it was as if she was Samuel. She was faking it. Or, alternatively, Scott suggests that she had a male accomplice with her in the room, and he pretended to speak as Samuel. But how was this possible? Well, Scott writes that most likely King Saul was in another room, and that's why this woman of Endor could fake it. And she knew exactly who had come to visit her, because according to the Bible, King Saul was taller than everyone else. So he had arrived at her place. She had immediately recognized King Saul, but she just played along. She put him in a different room, and then she tricked him. How then was she able to predict the future? Well, Reginald Scott says that King Saul was so distressed that while he was in this different room, he blurted out everything that had happened to him, God rejecting him, and for her it was not difficult to guess what fate was awaiting King Saul. His reputation had fallen so deeply, and she knew that the end was nigh for him. And then we have here King James I on the screen. When he was still King James VI of Scotland, he was a hardcore demonologist, really one of the hardliners. King James is generally known for commissioning the King James Version when he became King of England. He was not one of the translators himself, but he commissioned this Bible translation. Now, James liked to portray himself as this very intelligent scholar king. However, he was also ridiculed as being Europe's cleverest fool. A lesser known fact about King James is that he was a witch hunter when he was still King of Scotland. After his personal involvement in several witch trials, he wrote a tract against witchcraft, which is known as demonology, and it was published in 1597. This work aimed to prove wrong those who denied the reality of witches and witchcraft. It wanted to stress the danger that witchcraft posed to the monarchy and to the Protestant faith. As the Lord's anointed, King James had the God-given duty to cleanse his country from the slaves of the devil. Their witchcraft had to be battled against with all judicial means. The King's Treatise is full of biblical proof texts, and the story about the woman of Endor is actually the first one with which he begins his book. In it, he follows the common interpretation of her as a witch, and she had raised a demon, rather than Prophet Samuel himself. It is interesting to see what has happened with the rendering of the story about the woman of Endor in the King James Version. Between the red arrows, you can see that King Saul now asks, "Seek me a woman that has a familiar spirit." We also find this rendering in the Geneva Bible, the predecessor of the King James Version. So what is meant with a familiar spirit? Well, it's a typically English early modern concept, according to which a witch had often a domesticated demon in the disguise of a cat, a dog, an owl, or a mouse, as you can see on the picture on the screen. So that's a familiar spirit, and this familiar spirit would aid the woman with her harmful magic. The negative depiction of the woman of Endor in the King James Version is strengthened by the reference to her in the so-called paratext. And what do I mean with the word paratext? Now, paratext is not part of the translation itself, but we see it in the margin of the translation or in the introductions to the translation. Now, as you can see here on the screen, the woman of Endor is explicitly called a witch in the paratext, in the header and in the introduction. And this is in the King James Version. And this is significant because the use of the term witch in late medieval and early modern Britain, we see a variety in the use of this term. And I'm following here the views of, again, Ronald Hudson, who wrote an article about the use of the word witch in Britain at that time. Because the common people would not use the term witch to describe a beneficial magician. Instead, they would refer to someone as a cunning woman or as a cunning man. And someone who was a harmful magician, they would call a witch. But then the educated elites would use the term witch both for beneficial magicians and for harmful magicians. So according to Ronald Hutton, the use of the word witch could be a deliberate smearing technique by the educated elites, by also using it to refer to beneficial magicians. Because if an uneducated person would hear about the woman of Endor as a witch, through the King James Version, for instance, they would immediately associate her with a harmful magician. Whereas the translators could claim innocence. They would say, but we didn't mean it like that. For us, a diviner could also be a witch, a beneficial magician. And you can see here Hutton's conclusion when it comes to the use of this term. And I will conclude my talk by showing you some images that demonstrate the development of the woman of Endor as a witch of Endor, into a witch of Endor in the art of that time. The scholar Charles Zika has written several articles that deal with the portrayal of the woman of Endor in the art of that time, so I can highly recommend his work to you. Late medieval images that depict this biblical story, they focus on the interaction between King Saul and the prophet Samuel. They don't focus on the woman of Endor and her conjuration. And you can see an example of that on the screen. And look at the woman. She is youthful, she seems friendly and innocent. There is nothing malignant about her. A marked shift occurred in a miniature illustration in the early 15th century Parisian Bible. Here the woman does take center stage. She kneels before King Saul, and the apparition of Samuel is behind her. The woman is like a mediator between the king and the prophet. And look, above her we see a winged black demon that assures the reader that this scene is diabolical in nature. And then we see a painting by the Dutch artist van Oostzaanen, and it marks an even more radical shift in the representation of the story. We really see here how the learned concept of witchcraft had started to influence the art of that time. In the background, in the red circle, you can see the woman receiving King Saul and his servants. And then, in the second circle, you see the prophet Samuel coming out of his grave. He is being raised as a spirit. But in the foreground, the woman of Endor sits there in her magical circle. She is now a very powerful female necromancer, like a ritual magician. She's there in the circle, she's holding this magical wand. And we see other women as well. They are drinking, they're eating. They seem to be engaged in a Sabbath celebration. Also, we see naked females riding on demonic goats. And also, I'm coming back to the idea of the woman of Endor as a ritual magician, and that also reflects a shift at that time, because before, ritual magicians were usually perceived as being male, and now it could also be a woman. Also, I would like to draw your attention to the woman of Endor being portrayed as an older woman, in keeping with witchcraft conceptions of that time. Why this emphasis on the woman of Ender being an older woman? Because, according to the demonologist, sexual drive increased as women got older. And therefore, especially elderly women were seen as most vulnerable to the seduction by the devil. They had an insatiable sexual appetite. And also, you start seeing the woman of Ender being depicted naked, just like here. Her aging body is a sign of the depletion of her femininity. And here, the most influential artistic depiction of the woman of Ender in the 16th century, you can see on the screen. It is a woodcut, probably from 1569, by Johann Teufel. And crucially, it appeared in the Luther Bible from 1572. In this woodcut, the woman of Ender and the prophet Samuel, they are together in this magical circle. They're surrounded by magical paraphernalia, and you also see an altar-like table in the background. All of these paraphernalia could be interpreted as Catholic symbols, just like the rosary, which is hanging from her arm. And in a marginal gloss of the Luther Bible, there you go, marginal gloss, paratext, Luther stated that not Samuel himself had been raised, but an evil spirit. And it was raised by a sorceress, a Zauberin. So the evil character of the woman of Ender is being emphasized, and the demonic nature of Samuel's apparition. This painting by Andrew Lawrence was created probably halfway the 18th century. The time of the witch hunts had more or less come to an end. However, her depiction, as you can see on the screen, is still heavily influenced by the earlier portrayal of her. She's an old woman, she is evil, she is naked here. She is surrounded by diabolical forces. And she has this long, half-flowing, wild hair, this uncontrolled sexuality. It symbolized her hair. So, this is the story of only one biblical proof text, and I've tried to squeeze it into 40 minutes. And as you can see, it is so important to understand the whole reception history of a biblical text in the early modern witchcraft debates. And even then, of course, it further developed in the writings and the art of that time. We have witnessed this chilling unfoldment of a biblical text in which a kind, hospitable, and capable female diviner was turned into a slave of the devil, intent to harm, whereas according to the biblical text, she was there for a desperate man, nation and witchcraft in biblical times, and also post-biblical times, even pre-biblical times.
Thank you very much, Alinda, for this wonderful, thought-provoking lecture. I remind the audience that your questions can be submitted via Slido, and I have access to this. So I think perhaps we could start off with asking Alinda, is witchcraft mostly associated with women in the Bible?
Ah, yeah. So I can fill another lecture about this, but I'm going to keep it very brief. So when we look at just the terminology, we find terms for magicians, diviners, witches. There are quite a few terms, and also used for man. So when we look at the terminology, we see it being used for both genders. Also in the legislation, we find quite a few laws against these people, and directed against men, but also sometimes at women. But the Bible is notoriously tight-lipped about the actual practices. What do they do? But there are a few texts in the Hebrew Bible that throw a little bit more light on, and I'm very careful here, possible witches. And interestingly, these passages deal with women. And I want to say, for instance, in the book of Ezekiel, in chapter 13, we find the prophet Ezekiel engaged in a conflict with a group of women, and he accuses them not only of prophesying out of their own hearts, so it seems without God-given prophecy, but he also accuses them of keeping alive those who should die and killing those who should live. So it's like these women are capable of interfering in the natural order. Now, and most commentators, they've understood these women to be engaged in harmful magic. However, we have to be very careful because I would also like to state that they have been identified as necromancers. Maybe these were women who were engaged in mediumship, and that's why the reference to death. Or there is also a scholar who says, well, maybe they were midwives. Yeah, so very interesting. So again, we have to be very careful by saying, yeah, these are witches in the Bible. This is what they do. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Linda. I've got some very interesting questions that would pick up from couple of things that you were saying in the lecture. Do you think that there is a link between the Bible, witchcraft, and the view of homosexuality?
Oh, yes. Well, that's also a big topic. I think uh, what I try to do in my research is that we have to be so careful with biblicism. And biblicism is that you take texts out of the Bible and then you use them for contemporary life, daily society, our society. First of all, uh, I think we have to dig very deep into the actual meaning of a text. So when I speak about the witch, there is a law in Exodus 28, verse 18, that says, "You shall not allow a witch to live." So throughout history, up to the present day, many people take this as you're allowed to kill a witch. The death penalty is for a witch. And it's also explicitly a female witch, this law. Now, and then in my work, I look deeper and I say, what does it actually say? So, and that's the other part of my research, but maybe it's not, maybe it's a death penalty, but maybe not. Maybe she should be banished. Maybe her tools should be taken away. Maybe she's not allowed to engage in necromancy. But even then, if we could still take it as a law, if we say, okay, at face value, it is a law against, it's a death penalty for a witch, we have to look at the time of a text. When was it written? By whom was it written? Could there have been ideological motives behind it? So that could be the case with this law against the witch. that it stems from the time when the ancient Israelites had no longer any autonomy. It was ideological retro, like projection in the past, what they would do in their society. But they would not do it in their society because they were actually in exile, maybe, or they did no longer have autonomy. So, and so I know too little about when it comes to Bible and homosexuality, but I do want to stress that any legislation or non-legislative text from the Bible that seemingly denounce homosexuality should be taken at face value and applied to the present day.
Thank you very much, Linda. I've got another question, which I think again would follow perhaps, I mean, the way you have shared with us the wonderful images, and you have basically shown us that often the portrayal of witches are as old women. So there's a wonderful question here. Do you think there is a link between menopause and conception of older women as witches?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes, there was. And of course, nowadays we know much more about this stage in a woman's life. There's much more openness about it, and than back then. But it was definitely something that the demonologists would refer to. And there is a very crude joke, and it's in one of King James's letters, and that's it's the woman of Endor. He refers to the woman of Endor, but also to witches in general, that they are older. And it's basically that because of physical symptoms that you experience as a woman in menopause, he's referring to that in a very crude way. So absolutely, I do think that also that made a difference. And yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alinda. There is a question about whether you will be watching Wicked for good. So I don't know the program, but that's the question that's been
Yes. Yeah, well, the thing is, I haven't seen the first part, so I would have to see the first part, and then I have to go to the sequel. So, and yeah, maybe as a treat for having done this lecture, have finalized it, I'm going to go there. Who knows? That would be a very fitting a conclusion to this topic today. Yeah.
I also got another question about, do you think that the Bible is still used today to denounce witches and witchcraft?
Yeah. Yeah, this is also a very important one. And I thought about it within the context of this story. I immediately had to think of a book which I reviewed a few years ago by Jean Kabamba Kiboko. And her native country is the Central Democratic Republic of the Congo. And in her own society, a local Bible translation is being used, the Kisanga Bible. And in the translation of this story in the Kisanga Bible, the story about the woman of Endor, the woman has raised a mufu. Now, a mufu in their society is an angry, haunting ghost. So this puts the whole story of the woman of Endor in demonic light, which is extremely dangerous because in this society, Jean Kambamba Kiboko writes, there is still the belief in witches and witchcraft. It's still a reality. So she very critically looks at this Bible translation and other Bible translations that are used in our native country of the Congo. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Linda. We've only got a couple of minutes left, but there was the last question was about do you recommend any good reads on this topic? I know you have added a very helpful slide at the end of this presentation, but perhaps you might want to sum that up. Thank you.
Yes, so because the topic of the research into biblicism and the witch hunts is still in its infancy, we have scattered articles. This is still something, as I said, it's underexplored. So some of my articles, they deal with it. Um, I can highly recommend the works by Dr. Anne Jeffers, who deals with magic and divination in the time of the Bible and the ancient Eastern context of that. That's also a great starting point. As I said, and your works have been hugely influential for me, and such a pioneer in this. So I'm so happy that, yeah, we can work together in this as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alinda. I think we're coming right to the end of this lecture. I just want to remind the audience that there is a QR code for the feedback form, which is on the slide, I think, which might come up now. And the team are asking you to complete it. It only takes a couple of minutes and it's multiple choice. And while you are all doing it, I would like to let you know about the next lunch hour lecture, which is entitled From Waste to Wonder: Can Nature Leftovers Shape the Future of Green Manufacturing? And this lecture will take place on the 25th of November from 3 o'clock until 4 o'clock, from 1 o'clock, sorry, until 2 o'clock. It remains for me, of course, to thank you all, the audience, for attending Dr. Damsma's lecture. And I think you'll all join me in being really, really grateful for Dr. Damsma's generosity in sharing her invaluable research, in highlighting the importance of biblical texts on culture, gender issues in particular. And I think, it was a real privilege to attend this lecture. So thank you very, very much, Alinda. It was the most stimulating and thought-provoking lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.